I'm going to introduce Joe. Oh, wait, okay. I'm going to introduce Joe, and she asked me to do this, but I don't really know her. I don't really know her. She's a friend of mine from Austin, and I trust him. He told me that she was an amazing writer, and that we should know each other. And she sent me her book, because I'm from Mississippi. I've sort of made that work for myself. And being an other from Mississippi is what I've really made work for myself. And she was an other in Mississippi. She moved there from Boston with her family when she was very small to Mount Bayou. It's this. You have to be from Mississippi to really know what it means to move to Mount Bayou. It's a famous, almost completely African-American town. I mean, it was founded in the 1880s, I think, by black folks. And her family was from Boston, Jewish and white. You can't get more other than being a Jewish white Yankee in Mississippi. And this is an amazing story here. Her mother, Ora, taught in the high school. And I think I'm getting this right. Was sort of the first person who told these black students there was such a thing as black literature. And Toni Morrison once, when she was giving a lecture at the Louvre, said that all literature is about the other. You're either accepting the other, you're fearing the other, or you are the other. And I think this book sort of captures all of that. Certainly Joe's life has. And my blurb about it, I said, not all stories about the South are fictional and have characters in them named Atticus and Scout. Some are true and have real people in them named Ora and Joe. But just as Atticus and Scout have seared themselves into our cultural consciousness, Ora and Joe will take up residence in your own after reading The Outskirts of Hope. I began this book thinking it was about civil rights in Mississippi and a Jewish family's singular brave saga there in the 1960s. I ended it realizing it is a story about us all. It is an American one. And it is one told forgivingly about forgiveness. Here's Joe.
Kevin has written a beautiful book, actually two beautiful books, Mississippi Sissy, which was a few years back now, and describes his childhood. And I was choked up to tears many times during the book. And so when he said that he would support my efforts, my project, by writing a blurb for the back of the book, I was thrilled, and I can't thank you enough, Kevin. And then just recently, in the last few months, he has a new book out, I Left It on the Mountain, and it's heart-wrenching, and I hope that you will all take a look at it. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you to the folks at Book Inc. For letting us gather here in your beautiful, beautiful store. So I love being able to support local bookstores. I hope that while you're here, you will wander and enjoy the store and maybe come back to it at another time. So, do I need the mic if I step back? Is it harder to hear? Okay, I'll use it a little bit. But what I want to start with, you've heard a little bit about the story that when I was 10 years old, 1967, and my brother Charles was 11, we moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Mount Bayou, Mississippi, which was an all-black town in a very, very poor part of the state. And our dad started a clinic. He was a doctor. And very shortly after we moved there, our mother was recruited to teach English. And she was controversial and beloved and really had an impact. In many ways, even more than our father did. And initially, Charles and I were in the same school at St. Gabriel's Church School. And then eventually I transferred over to the public school where I was the only white student there. So this was the situation, and my mother is really the main character in the book. It's her story. I tried to write in her voice. And she, some of you have met her, she was an amazing woman. Very tiny. I look big standing next to her. She came up to about here on me by the end. She started out at 4'10" and shrank to about 4'6". Every ounce packed with energy and verve and a passion for life. And she didn't recognize what a jewel that she was. At least initially. By the end, she kind of figured it out when everybody was expressing their love to her and appreciation. But she was raised with the belief that a woman's role was to be a platform from which her husband and children could fly. So she was to make herself the best person she could by getting educated and doing things to build herself up, not so that she could be important and succeed, but so that her husband could and her family could. And she supported her husband and her father in their businesses, my dad in his pediatric office, my grandfather in his restaurant business. And that was all she did outside of the house. Even though she was trained English speech and drama, and she could have had a very dynamic career beyond being their support, this is what she had chosen to do, as well as raising the 4 kids. Well, one day, my father announced, pretty much out of the blue, though there were signals that this sort of thing was getting ready to happen, he came home and he said, "We're moving to Mississippi." And he told her about the job he'd just been offered. He didn't ask her. He didn't say, "What do you think?" He said, "We are moving to Mississippi, put the house on the market. You can stay until the end of the school year with the kids. I'm going to start commuting. Done deal." Well, she was blown away by this. Didn't really expect it. She knew he might make some changes, but she didn't expect to be uprooted and move 1,500 miles away. But she was a trooper, and she swore that no one would know that she was very upset by this. And at 10 years old, I bought into what she said, and I believed it, and I viewed this as the most incredible adventure that I could possibly have, and was very excited about it. So then years later, she wrote about it in a journal, and I had the opportunity to work with her and to try to capture her story. And the result after 8 years was the book that you have here. And I wanted to start with my first reading. There are about half a dozen of them that range from maybe 15 seconds to a couple of minutes. And I'll kind of interweave stories about our experience and what went into the book kind of in between. So the first one is a little bit about where the book title came from. So some of you may recognize the phrase, "the outskirts of home." It was actually President Johnson in his speech in 1964, in which he announced the war on poverty. And what he said at that time was, many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, some because of their poverty, some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. Well, I grew up on that philosophy. I knew about that quote when we first moved to Mississippi. My parents embodied that quote, and that was the driving force. If I'm honest about it, it was also my dad's midlife crisis. He was ready for an adventure himself, so here we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We could go serve humanity as he wanted to do, be a foot soldier in the war on poverty, and he could address his midlife crisis and go have this wonderful, wonderful adventure. So I just recently, just to share an anecdote that I just found out with the title, I was talking with my cousin, we were communicating by email, and this may or may not be true, so you can't really quote me on it. But when it had explained online where the title came from, he sent me a picture of his father talking with President Johnson. And he had created a little blurb, a little balloon coming out of his father's mouth saying, "Fringe of fantasy? No, I think outskirts of hope is a better phrase." And I wrote back to my cousin and I said, "Paul, are you suggesting something here, or are you just joking around?" And he wrote back, he said, "No, I think my father wrote that speech." And it turns out, and I hadn't realized this, his father was the director of communications for President Johnson's War on Poverty. He was speechwriting for the president at the time, and my cousin says it sounds like his style of wordsmithing. So it may well be, and chances are it is, that my uncle actually wrote the phrase, "the outskirts of hope." So when I picked that name for the book, I had no idea. And that may not be true. If it is, it's wonderful synchronicity and a serendipity. I like to think it's true, and maybe it is. We'll never know, because presidential speechwriters never get credit. So he gets credit for other things he did, other phrases he came up with, but this one we'll never know, and the people involved are long gone. So what I want to talk about next, I mentioned my mother was very kind of surprised by what happened, and she was eager to see what Mississippi was like. And so while my father was commuting back and forth and she was staying with the kids, they arranged a long weekend for her to go to Mississippi with him. So I'd like to read a passage that brings back what she experienced that first time. She was totally unprepared. She didn't know what to expect. No one told her how to behave or what was going to happen while she was there. As we drove south on Highway 61 toward the Mississippi state line, the road curved through pine forests almost as lovely as those I'd grown up with in New England, and the gently rolling terrain reminded me of the hills outside of Boston. This won't be so bad, I told myself as I looked out the car window at the lush landscape. Mount Bayou, where we were heading, was the oldest all-black town in the country. It would be the site of Leon's new clinic, which would serve the black population of Bolivar County. My husband, with such a big responsibility, so willing to help others. While I loved that in him, his decision meant that after spending most of my 44 years in the Boston area, I now had to say goodbye to the life I loved. Its theater and dinner parties, summers at the beach, and outstanding schools for my 3 young children. We would be one of 2 white families among the 1,300 people of Mount Bayou, and our presence alone would throw us into the heart of the civil rights movement. At the Mississippi border, a billboard greeted us with a picture of breathtaking antebellum mansions surrounded by magnolia trees. "Welcome to Mississippi, the Magnolia State." Moments later, the road transitioned from a well-maintained 4-lane highway to a bumpy 2-lane blacktop. Then we rounded a curve and the trees disappeared. The road straightened and the hills vanished. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but mud. Well, she grew more and more nervous as she was looking out over the mud. And she had a nervous bladder. There's kind of no polite way to say that. But the more nervous she got, the more uncomfortable she felt. I had begun to think that squatting by the side of the road where everyone could see would be preferable to waiting any longer, when we finally spotted what looked to be an abandoned gas station. It was completely deserted. No other cars, no staff. "Please, please let it be unlocked and let there be a bathroom," I said to myself. Moments later, I sighed with relief as Leon stopped in front of the dilapidated building, and I saw the sign that read "Women." I was halfway to the bathroom before I noticed a second sign that said "Whites Only." Desperate to go inside, I chose not to worry about it, and instead silently was grateful that I wasn't black. Once I was inside with the door shut behind me, it smelled so bad that I had to hold my breath. My shoes stuck to the floor as I stepped in dried urine. The seat was so disgusting that I didn't sit, but instead stood over it, growing angrier and angrier at the entire situation. How could Leon expect me to move to this awful place? By the time I was finished, I was so mad that I took the Kleenex that I had pulled from my purse and used and threw it on the floor. I couldn't tell the others what I had done. I was already embarrassed by my childish behavior. But I did tell them how revolting the restroom had been. The sad thing, John said, John was their traveling companion, is that it'll be a black person who has to clean it. A wave of guilt washed over me as I thought of the dirty tissue I'd left on the floor. For the next hour, I stared out the window, my head beginning to ache as images raced through my mind. Mississippi, shacks, filthy restrooms, mud, more mud. So that was her first experience. And word got out, because my father didn't know to be quiet about it, what had happened. And so the reputation that she got in the town as the very first thing was, oh yeah, this is the doc's wife that used the whites-only bathroom. And she felt hated, lost, out of place, other, and it was a pretty rough transition. But she kept that very positive face. We never knew, I never knew, I should say, how upset that she was. So that was her introduction to Mound Bayou. And what happened next was that she started teaching. She'd been trained in speech, English, and drama, as I mentioned. She had taught as a short-term sub for a few weeks during World War II, but she felt woefully inadequate as a teacher. But once we were in Mound Bayou, she got recruited to come teach at the local high school, where she would be the only white teacher, all of her students would be black, and she said yes. And she didn't know what she was going to do. There was no curriculum for her. She just was plopped into the classroom. So pulling on her training in speech, English, and drama, she decided to work on the students' dialect, because she couldn't understand them. She said, I got to do something to make it so I can understand my students. So she used the phonetic alphabet, and which basically is a way of writing words where you sound out how, or spell out how they sound, and it made it easier for her to communicate. And her approach was to say, there's nothing wrong with the way you speak. But you talk about you want to move north, you want to go get a job when you finish school, and you may not be able to if no one can understand you. So think of it like a second language. And she found from the beginning a way to work with their students on their pronunciation in a way that didn't hurt their self-image at all. It's pretty miraculous what she was able to do. So this next reading is a description of what happened in one of her early classes. So she'd already kind of found her footing. Her students already liked her, but they were still kind of nervous. And they didn't always respond, so she had to be a little bit creative. So glancing at my seating chart, I called on a girl who looked a little bit sleepy. Naomi, I want you to repeat a word for me. Naomi pointed to herself as if to say, what, me? I nodded. Please say the word ask. Axe. I looked around the room. Can anyone hear the difference between what I said and what Naomi said? My heart pounded in my chest as I wondered if I'd ever be able to get the students to respond. Frag, one of the boys, can you hear the difference? No, ma'am. Listen again. Ask, axe. I said, writing the phonetic spelling on the board, ask, axe. Look at how they're spelled using phonetics and see how my mouth moves differently with the two words. They stared at me, but I didn't see any glimmer of understanding, of interest, no heads nodding, no signs that they heard what I said. I sighed internally, frantically trying to figure out how to capture their imagination. Let's try something different. I want everyone to hiss like a snake. Don't be shy with me. Sss. A few started to hiss. Well, that's it, but I need everyone to join. Let's make the students in the next classroom think we've just released a whole nest of snakes. Sss. They all hissed, laughing at themselves. Well, great. Now that's the sound in the middle of the word ask. The next step is to put an ah before the sound, before the hiss. Well, a boy in the back of the room started experimenting. Ass. And then he guffawed. And then the boys around him started laughing. As I walked toward their desks, They were suddenly quiet, their eyes growing large, fearful that I'd be mad at the disrespect. Instead, I said, "Congratulations, gentlemen, you figured it out." I could feel the whole class relax. Then I walked back to the front of the room and I wrote ass on the blackboard. Now let's all say it together. Ass. Amid much laughter, the whole class repeated after me, and as the bell rang to signify the end of class, I said hurriedly, "Now all you have to do is put a k at the end of it, and you've got the word ask." So my mother found a way to communicate with her students, and she continued to do so for the next 2 years, and just had a remarkable impact. She later went on, after we left Mississippi, she continued her teaching. In Miami, she taught in the inner city there, called Liberty City. Then she moved out to LA. She taught eventually in South Central, where some of our students were gang members. And I've had the opportunity to chat with them and interview some of them. And one young man said, the lessons I learned in her classroom, the self-respect, the dignity I felt in there is what gave me the strength not to join the gangs. And when I heard that, I was pretty moved and pretty proud of my mom. Another young man said, he's now in his 50s, he said, "I didn't know it was an English class. I thought it was a class on life." So she had this amazing impact on her students, and I was very, very proud of her for doing that. So she, the longer she stayed there, the more involved she got politically. And she wanted to bring black literature into the classroom. And it wasn't a big part of the community. It was protected. Mound Bayou was a remarkable town where the black population, since its inception, had owned property. There was a middle class, there were store owners, there were people in the medical field, and they had something they wanted to protect. And there was a fear that if the students were exposed to the black literature, that they might start making waves. And then they would attract the attention of the KKK. So she had introduced it into the classroom, but it wasn't always easy. In the midst of all this, it was April 1968, and we got word that Dr. King had been shot. We started getting phone calls very early in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, from my parents' friends, from my father's colleagues, from family members, saying there is rioting going on all over the country. You need to stay at home and keep a low profile or leave town for a few days, but you guys are the only white ones there. People are going to lash out against you. And we had a conversation over breakfast, and Charles probably remembers this, where my parents basically said, all the work that we've been doing means nothing if we just hide out right now. We're going to go to work. But you 3 kids stay home. So our older brother Philip, who was at this point 14 and at the high school, said, "Well, I'm not staying home. I want to go to the high school." And they said, "Well, okay." And then Charles and I said, "Well, if Philip gets to go to school, we're going to school." So we all went out into the community, and I'm very glad we did, because we were accepted into the grieving process. We were welcomed. There was no hostility toward us. We hugged our friends and we cried together. And I want to mention something from Kevin's book, Mississippi Sissy, because he remembers the same day. We're about the same age. And he went to a school where it wasn't, there weren't black kids in his school. And he got to class and the kids were celebrating. And you'll have to tell me if I don't get this exactly right, but the teacher closed the door so that the black janitor wouldn't hear, because that would be rude. But the kids were celebrating. And I looked at that difference, how we were welcomed into the grieving versus what was happening elsewhere, and was so glad that we had gone out into the community. Well, about a week after that, the students wanted to do something to mark the event, something to remember Dr. King by. So in his honor and in his style, they decided to have a peaceful march. And they didn't want to just stay in Mound Bayou where it was the black community. They wanted to reach out to the next town where there were white people as well. So they got together with the students from the black high school in the next town, and they organized a march. And my mother and our older brother Philip decided they would march too. They didn't decide. They felt compelled. There was no choice. They were gonna participate. And this is what my mother experienced at that march. They organized in the black part of town, and they were all together in a line. And we began to slowly walk down the sidewalk, the sun already high in the sky and beating down on us. I looked into the street and noticed that a police car stayed right beside my partner and me, my walking partner. The officer in the passenger seat pointing his rifle at my partner the entire time. As we started to walk down the sidewalk, people on the porches began singing hymns. A singing elderly person occupied every rocking chair we marched by. They waved to us, cheered us on with their voices raised in song. Many cried. I became so accustomed to the presence of our well-wishers that it struck me as odd whenever I saw an empty seat. I suspected that whoever lived there must have been out at work or sick, because otherwise they would have been there watching. What a change a few minutes later when we marched into the white section of town. Different world. Instead of dirt roads, there were paved streets lined with well-kept sidewalks. Rather than tiny wooden shacks, handsome brick and stone homes with manicured lawns beside the streets. Instead of the warmth of voices raised in song, there was absolute quiet. Not a soul in sight, for the residents had locked up their homes as tightly as possible. Drapes were drawn shut. Streets were deserted. The silence relentless. We marched for close to 2 hours, crisscrossing the town until we'd walked down every block. Finally, we stopped in front of City Hall, and one of the ministers stepped to the front of the line, and in a deep, booming voice, he said, "Let us all now bow our heads in prayer." Resuming our march, we returned to the black section of town, where we stood in front of one of the churches, a small wooden structure with peeling paint. The students wandered off, but the adults gathered on the church steps, talking over the events of the day. Suddenly, over the chattering, I heard a deep baritone quietly singing, "We shall overcome." One by one, the rest of us joined in. As if choreographed, we formed 4 lines on the church steps, standing closely with arms linked. So that was her experience the week after Dr. King was assassinated. Part of the community, welcomed, allowed, privileged to share in their grief. We were a part of something wonderful and important. But there was a price to pay. I've said as a 10-year-old child, I didn't necessarily see that. I was incredibly optimistic and adventurous and said, this is all going to be good. And it was largely for me. Charles was a year older. He doesn't know I'm going to read this section, but I'm going to quote from him. And this is something he said to me just a few years ago when I was talking with him, interviewing him as I was working on this book. He saw right through my pretense, I'm now talking as my mother, and referred to it as the great lie. He said, the lie was that it was all good. We were a wonderful family, and it was a big adventure, and nothing was being taken away from us. And we were all going to write wonderful books, and be famous, and we were important and fabulous, and everybody would love us and think we were the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, he couldn't say anything at the time because I refused, speaking as my mother, I refused to see anything but the good. So he wasn't allowed to notice bad. And he was alone in his misery. So I believe Charles also viewed it as a wonderful adventure and is really glad we went and has great memories from that time. But there was that price. And there was also a price for me. And I'm going to share an event from the first football game we attended. And this will be the last of my readings. But football was big. I mean, we came from the Northeast where people played football, and I played football as a kid. I was a real tomboy. But it wasn't the huge event that it is in a Mississippi town on Friday night when the whole town comes out for the football games. It was a celebration. This tiny town with 1,300 people had a traffic jam because there were so many pickup trucks with people coming in from miles around for the high school football game. And my parents were having a great time. My mother, who was worried about how she was being accepted after her difficulties with her first trip and the segregated restroom, was thrilled because the woman sitting next to her in the stands kept saying to her over and over the whole evening, "We're so happy you're here. You and your husband are doing good work for our town, and we've got medical care we didn't have, and you're a wonderful teacher." And my mother was happy. She was in heaven. I started out sitting in the stands with my parents, but I got bored, and so I wandered away. I like playing football, but it turns out that watching it is kind of dull. So I climbed down to look for my friends. I found some older boys, maybe 14 or 15 years old, throwing a ball around behind the stands. But I didn't know any of them, so I asked if they'd seen Tuda or Flit or Clarence, the buddies I already had. "Look at what we got here," the tallest one said. "What's your name?" "Joe." "You want a boy or a girl?" said another one. I think they were confused because my hair was too long for a boy, but I was dressed in hand-me-down jeans and a baggy t-shirt, clothes from my older brothers. Plus, they'd never heard of a girl named Joe. "Feel that hair," the first one said, touching my hair and rubbing it between his fingers. "I'm used to that by now because it happens a lot. My folks here have never touched a white person's hair, and they're curious. I let my friends at school do it, but this time was different, and I got scared. I started to back up, thinking it was time to run, but I backed right into one of them. "Hold on there, Whitey. Don't keep us guessing. Are y'all a boy or a girl?" Before I could answer, the first boy pushed me down. I hit my head hard on the ground, but I was so scared I barely felt it. "Let's find out. Pull his pants down." Then one of them held my arms down while another unsnapped my pants. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. I tried to yell out to the other kids milling about behind the stands, but my voice wouldn't work. So I just kept kicking, and I managed to get free before the boys could do anything else. Then I ran away from them as fast as I could, snapping up my pants while I ran. I didn't even know I was bawling until I heard one of them calling after me, "Let the crybaby run back to Mommy and Daddy." I stood next to the stands, pretending to watch the game until I could breathe easily again. I kept looking around, thinking that everybody had seen and would be laughing at me, but nobody seemed to notice. I thought about telling Mom and Dad what had happened, but that would only make it worse. Just thinking about talking to them was too embarrassing. So for the 2 years that we were there, this sort of thing happened to me on and off, and I never talked with my parents about it. It was a price that we paid, and it was a worthwhile price. I got through it. Our family got through it. Charles got through it. My older brother paid a price. He, at 14 years old, was sent to live with our sister, who was 19, newly married, and going into her junior year of college. It got too dangerous in town for Philip because he'd gotten involved in civil rights. Whether it was true or not, my parents were told there was a price on his head. So my mother had to say goodbye to her older son and have him live with his sister. So yes, there was a price to pay, but my parents were heroes for doing this and getting involved. And in writing this book, I've gotten to appreciate more about what my parents went through. I think about the movie Selma, and the film footage that you see in that movie of the awful things happening is what my parents saw on the TV just before they were deciding to move there, and they still had the courage to do it. I'm very proud of them for that. And my hope with this book moving forward is that I can use it to help further the conversation about racism, because it's very easy for many of us, especially if we're privileged, if we have all the advantages, to say we're a post-racial society. We have a biracial president. It's not an issue anymore. And I've had friends in Texas object to my saying that it is. Say, can't we get beyond that? It's not a problem anymore. Just just move forward. And I don't think that's true. I think it's still very hard growing up black in our country. And I'm hoping that because I've written this book, I've ended up with a platform that I kind of never expected to have. And I want to use that to forward the conversation. Because I think while we do need to move forward, and we can move forward, we also need to recognize that we do have very serious problems, and we have to fix them. So thank you all for being here, and I'm happy to field questions if you have any questions.